How a backpack found in a waste sorting plant triggers an international investigation. It sounds almost ridiculous, but therein lies the power of such stories. Amidst bags and cardboard boxes, an object suddenly appears, weaving a thread to a person's life. The black fabric backpack with no logos surfaced near Fujin, where the conveyor belt rumbles so loudly one can only speak in a half whisper, and the air smells of wet paper and diesel. An ordinary shift, an ordinary stream of waste, until one of the workers pressed the emergency stop button. On the 28th of March 2017, Mott, a shift worker with a habit of sorting everything neatly, noticed that the backpack was not one of those carelessly discarded. The zipper was stuck, but under his fingers, a small inventory list unfolded. A men's sweatshirt, grey, cotton, slightly stretched at the cuffs, but clean and neatly folded. A paperback in Polish, soft cover, one corner bent, a dried bus ticket tucked between the pages, and a thin thermal ticket from H.G. Putniczki Prievoz, Zagreb, Rijeka, dated the 12th of February, 2017. No documents, no wallet, no phone. The items seemed to say, "A man traveled from the capital to the sea, read in Polish, and was an orderly person. Otherwise, the sweatshirt would have been crumpled." What's disturbing about it? Individually, nothing. Together, a too complete silhouette of an unknown person. The backpack was handed over to the police. The process continued without drama, protocol, grey background, a sealed bag. The sweatshirt was packed separately. Fabric remembers more than paper. Experts took swabs from the collar and sleeves, obtained a profile and ran it through international databases. In such moments, no one usually expects a miracle. Too often, chemistry remains silent. But this time, the database responded almost immediately. A DNA match, with a profile in the Interpol database. The name appeared as a sober line, like a phone notification. Tomas B, Polish citizen. The country had reported him missing on the 1st of March of the same year, 3 weeks before Mart took the backpack off the belt. And at that moment, the nameless object ceased to be just a find. A person emerged, who at home perhaps had a cat, a sister, urgent emails at work, and their own plans for the beginning of spring. A geography arose. Zagreb, Rijeka, and then some detour that was not on the timetable. And a time counter began to run. If his belongings are here, where is he himself? This is how a case begins, in which we will piece together the crime not from loud headlines but from everyday traces, from a thermal paper ticket, from a grey sweatshirt, from cameras at the toll booth, and from how people keep their days, or lose them. The backpack gave us a name and a point on the map. We continue. The road from Žabika bus station to the exit for the A6 and to the one who stopped by the roadside that evening and dimmed the headlights. The story is just beginning to unfold. But before we drive down that road to the A6 exit and the grey Astra, we need to take a step back and look at the man whose name lit up in the database. Who was Tomas B before his backpack ended up in Croatia? Tomas, 34, Warsaw. An IT specialist of the kind who carries his ID in an inconspicuous pocket and always has the soup of the day for lunch. He lived alone in a rented apartment not far from the subway, a hallway with a hook for his only jacket, a kitchen with a kettle on the fridge, a shopping list and 2 magnets from Krakow. On weekdays, he left the house shortly before 9, walked to the station with headphones in his playlist, sometimes Polish rock, sometimes a podcast about programming languages. At the office, he had a fixed desk by the window and the habit of leaving his cup with the playful inscription on the windowsill. At the end of the day, he locked his laptop in a locker, turned the key, turned off the light. A pedant. No secret double life. A stable job at a technology company. Server support. Rare assignments to Grilla backup and long email correspondences. In the department, they said, reliable. That meant not conflict-averse, not prone to sudden decisions. The annual bonuses were enough for trips to neighboring countries and a membership at the swimming pool near his home. The credit card, no arrears, the utility bills, by direct debit. In his private life, a pause, a few short romances, a maintained distance from ex-partners, evenings with series and board games, sometimes a meeting with his sister in a cafe halfway between her and his neighborhood. A week before his disappearance, 2,000 euros were transferred from his sister to Tomas's account. Not a huge sum, but noteworthy. Exactly such numbers usually trigger conversations about debts, disputes, and who owes what to whom. Not here. The money was accompanied by a purchase agreement for an old car. His sister had decided to change her car and took over Tomas's former station wagon at a quite modest price. The papers were neatly drawn up. Date, signatures, key handover. The irony is that this transaction almost intentionally rules out the popular version of the debt trap. No trap. The last few days before the trip look almost boring. A correspondence with a colleague about on-call duty, a shopping cart in an online store with a cable set, an entry in the calendar. Saturday, departure. The Warsaw-Zagreb ticket was bought on the 11th of February, 2017. Early morning, without luggage. Only hand luggage. It looks like a short trip to switch off, and there's nothing strange about that. February is the ideal time to escape the grey Warsaw slush towards the sea, if only to catch a breath. Tomasz has no debts, except for that coffee machine he was paying for in installments and which he probably loved more than necessary. There are almost never cups in the sink. Everything is immediately rinsed, put away. No criminal connections, his passport, valid, visas in order. The internal chats with colleagues, every day. Who takes the shift? Release schedule. A neighbor remembered that he always held the door open in the stairwell and helped her carry boxes of cat food a few times. Such a person, about whom one usually says, to himself, but nice. And honestly, the biography seems to be intentionally crafted so that the investigation has no lead. No jealous partners, no black accounting, no hidden loans, and no toxic correspondences. There is an orderly man who plans his vacation with 3 clicks and sends his sister a thumbs-up emoji after signing the car contract. His last significant financial activity. That very flight ticket. That's it. And here, the gap arises. Tomas's normal world provides no motives to disappear without a trace. He isn't hiding. He isn't fleeing. He isn't cancelling payments. He simply gets on a plane to Zagreb, then a train, and somewhere on the way to the sea, he takes a wrong turn. Why Rijeka of all places? Who did he meet there? The answer will come together a little later. From the parking lot at Jabica bus station, from the cameras on the A6 toll road, and from the grey Opel that Tomasz got into on the evening of the 12th. From the parking lot at Jabica bus station, from the cameras, and from the grey Opel. This is where the thread becomes tangible for a second and immediately breaks again. What is Tomasz B's last documented route? Saturday, 11th of February. The morning flight Warsaw-Zagreb, a short stopover at a cafe, hand luggage, that very black backpack. The next day, he gets on the HZPP train to Rijeka. Gentle rattling, fogged windows, luggage racks with subdued light. The ticket. No window seat. But Tomasz holds a book in Polish the whole time, tucking the bookmark into his hoodie pocket during breaks. According to the timetable, the train arrives in the evening. An announcement in Croatian. A platform smelling of brake pads and damp iron. From the station to Jabica, a few minutes walk downhill to the bay. Surveillance cameras capture a man with a backpack who closely resembles Tomasz. Dark jeans, sneakers, the gait of a tired traveler who is no longer thinking about photos, but about a warm dinner. The recording shows him walking to the edge of the parking lot, looking around, checking his phone once or twice and putting it in his pocket. A moment later, a grey Opel Astra gently pulls up to the curb, without honking, without haste. A brief flash of the turn signal, like a wave. The car stops exactly so that the camera sees the rear door and a quarter of the windshield, the rest disappearing in the reflections of the shop windows. The driver is not recognizable. The face is obscured by reflections, and a faint interior light glows inside. Tomas leans forward as if to get a closer look and nods. The front door opens. He sits next to the driver, pulls the backpack to his feet, his body obscuring the camera. The door closes gently. The Astra drives off, merges into traffic, and 2 seconds later is out of frame. No direction, no license plates. The camera is positioned slightly higher and only captures the roof and reflections. In the frame remain an empty curb and a few pigeons that didn't even fly away. This is the last point where Tomas is surely alive and visible. After that, silence. No calls from his number. No new payments. The trail breaks precisely at that movement of the door handle and the sound of the tires. And from that second on, all attention shifts to the car. A grey Opel Astra with no face, no legible license plate, no route. Finding it means putting the road back on the map and understanding where the man from the video was taken. The next step, a clue on the bodywork and the path via city and highway cameras. A clue on the bodywork and the path via city and highway cameras. That's exactly where the trail is heading. How do you find a single grey Opel Astra in an entire region? One starts with movement arithmetic. If Tomas got into the car at Žabika in the evening, every exit from Rijeka towards the highway gives us a time window of only a few minutes. The city map is divided into sectors. West towards Kastav, east towards the E65 and the A6 toll road. The police request the entire evening pool of footage from cameras at traffic junctions for the 12th of February. This is not a movie where a single zoom button solves everything. Hours in front of monitors, rewinding, taking notes. Sedans, crossovers. Greys with a hint of graphite and a hint of dust. Most cars are sorted out based on trivialities. A sticker on the window, a scratched bumper, an extra roof rack. Around 1720, a camera at the Rijeka Istok exit captures a long shot. A grey Astra merges into traffic. The same flat silhouette, not a brand new bodywork, clean wheel covers. For a fraction of a second, the headlight glare of a neighboring car obscures the license plate. Then it is highlighted by a flash from a billboard. The strip of characters is blurred but not unusable. The first 2 letters of the region and the last 2 digits are legible. That's a lot already. Inside the car, 2 people. The reflective surface of the glass turns them into shadows. The guessing game stops, and iron and barriers take over. After the interchange comes the toll booth of the A6 Grobnik. There, the automatic license plate recognition system knows neither fatigue nor weather. It captures every car, matching the image with the characters. At 1732, the database delivers a clear imprint, the complete license plate of the same Astra. A single sequence of digits, and the grey, faceless body transforms into a concrete vehicle with a history of technical inspections, tire changes, and receipts. When the license plate is entered into the police computer, the screen displays the owner's card, registered to Pota K, 36 years old. Address, Rijeka. The profession sounds like an advertisement on a bulletin board at a hardware store. Technician for the maintenance of ventilation systems. Not a taxi, not a rental car, not a company fleet, a private vehicle. And at this moment, the uncertainty shrinks to a single name associated with the last hours of Tomas's life. Not a grey Opel, but Piotr K's Astra, Not someone at the wheel, but a specific person who has a schedule for drives, clients, a garage where he keeps canisters and a set of keys. The picture began to come together. A camera records the meeting at Jabika. Rijeka Istok confirms the direction. Grobnik prints the license plate. This is no longer an urban legend of got in and disappeared, but a road corridor that can be followed further. See where this Astra left the toll road, when it came back, what is visible on the recordings of the bridge over the Rychicina. And most importantly, who is Pota K? How does he live? And why was his car the last place Tomas was seen alive? The investigation takes the next logical step, to get to know the owner of the grey Astra better and to follow the path from Grobnik to where the connection finally breaks off. Getting to know the owner of the grey Astra better, a logical step. But who is he? This man at the wheel, whose face blurs in the reflections on the recording? Pota K, 36. Rijeka. A rented two-room apartment in a house on the hill. From the window, one can see a piece of the bay and the roofs of warehouses. Lives alone. Every morning, the same routine. Down to the kiosk where he buys a newspaper and a small cappuccino to go. Then to the workshop of a service company. Position: technician for the maintenance of ventilation systems. The work clothes are always fresh. The tools are organized in compartments. Tape measure with tape measure. Cable tie with cable tie. His Astra: an ordinary urban workhorse. A mat in the back seat, a stepladder in the trunk, a case with screwdrivers, a pair of gloves. On the toll road, his car drives with an ENC tag. Automatic payments are set up so that the bill arrives by email before he has taken off his jacket. Criminal record? None. Fines? A few minor things. Wrong parking and a speeding violation of 10. The financial situation is unremarkable. He pays more often by card than with cash. Loans are not overdue. Utility bills are paid at the beginning of the month. On his phone, a minimum of apps. On social networks, he is almost a ghost. An empty avatar. Rare reactions to other people's photos. No likes for controversial topics. No long posts about justice. Colleagues say Piotr is like a metronome at work. He comes to the client, nods friendly, checks the filters, prepares a cost estimate, drives away again. He doesn't tell jokes, doesn't go to company parties, but if asked, he helps to transport a washing machine or assemble a cupboard. Neighbors describe him with similar words. Quiet, to himself, polite but reserved. And this is precisely where the peculiarity lies. This is not the portrait one expects when looking for a person who drove away a foreigner, after which he disappeared. No stories of conflicts, no obviously dangerous company. No peculiarities in the news. Even his preferences are calm. Old rock playlists in the car, canned goods from the same supermarket, neatly folded receipts in the glove compartment. In the evenings, he is usually at home. Sometimes he drives to the gym on the outskirts of the city. Sometimes to the car wash, where he likes to watch the water with shampoo bead off the windshield. Everything points to a person who lives according to a schedule and loves nothing more than order. How can such a metronome be connected to Tomas, who flew in from another country and got into his car an hour after his arrival? No common friends, no common workplaces, no habit of taking selfies on the waterfront, where the cameras should hardly have erred. A void gapes between them. And the calmer Piotr appears from the outside, the stronger the question gnaws. What connects these two? A random favor, an appointment, a secret no one knew about? The investigation does not rely on feelings. There is a car, a timeline, the last point where Tomas is in the picture. So one must look where order sometimes betrays a person better than any portrait. At things and digital traces. A search warrant for Piotr's apartment and car is obtained for the seizure of computers, storage media, telephones. This is not a dramatic scene from a movie. A sealed envelope, 2 pairs of gloves, an inventory. The door to his apartment is opened with a normal key. Inside, a neatly made bed. On the table, a stack of printed instructions for maintaining ventilation ducts. On the shelf, plastic containers with screws, sorted by size. It seems to be a world without surprises. But precisely such worlds hide something when something is wrong, deep and carefully. Next up is the technology: laptop, external hard drives, phone, memory cards. And they are precisely what should provide the answer as to why the silent technician was the last driver for a man wanted by Interpol. And they are precisely what should provide the answer as to why the silent technician was the last driver for a man wanted by Interpol. The answer begins with the evidence boxes and the rustling of bags. What was found in Pota K's apartment? On the 5th of April 2017, the door to his two-room apartment is opened with an official key. Inside, everything is as tidy as the neighbors described. A made bed, tools in plastic containers with stickers in the refrigerator, yogurt, water, and a container of soup. On the table, a laptop. Next to it, two smartphones of different ages, the charging cables rolled up with rubber bands. They are packed first. Under the television, a small plastic case with a micro SD card is found. It looks like a random memory chip from a camera or a dash cam, but the casing is slightly melted, the edges as if they had touched hot metal. Inside, empty. No files. Not deleted, but really empty, like a clean page someone held over a flame hoping the letters would disappear. Next, to the kitchen. Under the sink, an ordinary trash bag. On top, the plastic packaging of milk and an empty cup of coffee creamer. Beneath it, a crumpled receipt from a hardware store, dated the 10th of February. The items are legible: universal knife, polypropylene rope, roll, plastic tub, 2 pieces, bleach. The total, average, like for a spring cleaning shopping trip. Each of these items by itself is not criminal, but together they form a list one would not want to see a day before a meeting with a foreigner. Especially remembering Piotr's meticulousness and his love for order. He rarely makes impulse purchases. In the bathroom, cleanliness, the smell of chlorine, as if an invisible cleaning lady had recently been here. In the cabinet, a supply of gloves, a roll of trash bags, new sponges. On the balcony, a couple of plastic tubs, one of them with a worn bottom. All of this proves nothing yet. A knife can be bought for a repair, a rope for fastenings at work, bleach, a common household chemical for splashes on a shirt. But if the data matches the trip to Grobnik, such household equipment sounds different, like tools for actions one prefers not to talk about. Meanwhile, the room is relieved. The system block, an external hard drive, memory cards from a camera, an old smartphone with a cracked screen are seized. Each device receives a bag, a seal, and a label. All of this is taken to the laboratory. There, connection protocols, lists of networks, attempts to rewrite the memory card are examined, and, most importantly, an attempt will be made to recover deleted data from the micro SD card whose plastic betrayed the heat. Here, not disputes decide, but bites. Who corresponded with whom? Who arranged meetings? What he wanted to record and what he tried to delete? For now, the found objects only indicate preparation, suddenly practical and too well thought out for a random ride. There is no direct connection to Tomas yet, but in the hands of the experts lies the key to the next door: digital forensics. To there, the laptop, phones, and all storage media are sent, not to understand words, but timestamps, what Piotr did in the days before the meeting at Jabika and on the night the connection broke off. The electronics are taken to the laboratory, but in parallel, what rarely lies is checked: the road and the receipts. What other actions of Pota K were recorded during the period of Tomas B's disappearance? It begins with his ENC tag, a small plastic box on the windshield that debits the toll on the highway. The protocols are dry like a receipt and precisely for that reason, reliable. In it, 2 trips to the same mountain sector, to Mokopalj. The first, on the 11th of February, 1 day before the meeting at Jabika. The time of exit towards A6, the entry at Grobnik, then the exit near Australia. On the same day, a receipt from INA appears for Piotr, refueling a canister. And that is not filling the tank on the way home from work. The receipt is from the eve of a mountain trip, a separate item, canister. The liter quantity matches what fits into an ordinary plastic container, as if someone brought fuel in advance to where there is no power outlet and only the wind can be heard. The second trip, on the 13th of February, early in the morning after the disappearance, the same corridor, entry, exit, as if someone is returning on an already known path to finish something. At the gas station near the exit, Piotr buys 2 coffees on a 2 for the price of 1 offer. The receipt, laconic, but it often becomes the basis for fantasies. So someone else was there. The cameras cut that short. In the parking lot, the same grey Astra, a single driver at the wheel. No passenger, no shadow of a second silhouette, even the passenger door is not opened. One sees how Piotr places both cups in the cup holder, takes a sip from one, and leaves the second for later. His face is calm, without haste. 5 minutes, and he drives back to the highway. If one places these 2 tiny scenes side by side, a mundane business trip no longer sounds plausible. Yesterday, a filled canister and a trip to the mountains. Today, the same path and 2 coffees, even though he is alone in the car. The dates, 11th and 13th of February, fit exactly into the framework of the foreigner's disappearance, who had gotten into his car on the evening of the 12th. No arguments on the cameras, no chases, no witnesses. Only a plan that looks like a plan. Preparation, a night in the wilderness, return. However, there is no direct evidence of a crime. Buying coffee is not a crime. Transporting a canister is not a crime. But for the investigation, these are markers. The area is covered, the travel corridor outlined. The legend of the accidental ride crumbles. The version of a third person is dismissed thanks to the video recordings. The second cup is explained by the offer and the habit of buying in stock. Piotr's behavior remains in a grey area, too purposeful, too repetitive. The next logical step is to understand why he needed exactly this mountain section. The answer is hidden where the asphalt ends and the gravel road begins. On a forest road leading to a small house, the keys to which are usually kept by the forester. Here is the English translation of your story, with numbers written out as words and maintaining the original narrative style and tense. There, where the asphalt ends and the gravel path begins, the answer lies hidden. But how does one find a specific place among dozens of clearings and dirt roads? How did the investigation find the forest cabin? The starting point is the container near Fujine, into which the backpack once went. A dog handler takes a scent sample from the objects. The dog makes an impatient circle and pulls towards the road, further on, to the edge of the forest, damp needles underfoot. The trail leads onto an old gravel road that the locals call Path to the Pasture. At the fork, a tiny signpost from the Forestry Administration. Here, a person appears who knows these places better than anyone else, the forester. One asks him, who picked up the keys for the hunting lodges on the weekend that fell on the 11th and 12th of February? The forester remembers immediately. The Dolak cabin key was indeed picked up, not by tourists, but but by locals. He had given the key to an acquaintance of Pota K, so he could stop by for one night with a friend. On the forester's phone, a simple SMS with the name Piotr and the time of the meeting at the forest house. No long correspondences, a quick agreement, and a thank you via smiley. This is already enough to narrow down the map to a single square. Dolak, an old forester's cabin off the road, 4.5 kilometers on gravel from Markopalj. Now another detail is added to the puzzle. During the search at Piotr's among his keys, one is found with a plastic tag on which Dolak is written with a simple marker. Exactly the same word as in the forester's SMS. Two threads have connected. The dog tracked the route to the forest road. The witness named the name and time. The key at Piotr's is the material confirmation. An abstract forest turns into a point on the map, the Dolak cabin. This is no longer just an area of interest, but a possible scene where the night of the 12th to the 13th of February did not go as planned in any correspondence. What remains is the simplest and hardest thing: to open the door, turn on the light, and see what the walls, the stove, and the sink have to say. Opening the door, turning on the light, and seeing what the walls, the stove, and the sink will say. That is how we entered Dolak. But what did the experts find in the cabin and on Pota K's laptop? First, the pipes spoke. The siphon under the tap looks freshly installed, but on the thread, crystals, a characteristic smell of chemicals. The laboratory takes swabs. Traces of bleach and microparticles of epithelial tissue are detected in the samples. The DNA profile matches the previously established profile of Tomas B. Water washes everything away, but plastic remembers. In the stove, a thick layer of soot and ash, in which, under the microscope, fragments of melted synthetic fibers clumped into spheres can be seen. Their composition matches the cheap polypropylene rope from the receipt of the 10th of February. In the corner where a lantern hangs, slightly bare spots are visible on the wall, as if someone had gone over them with a scouring pad. Light from a sharp angle highlights a network of micro-scratches on the floor. No bloody drama, as is popular in films. Only cleanliness and the smell of chemicals. And that is precisely more frightening. Someone meticulously covered up traces, which means they knew what they were doing. In the stove ash, two more details are found. Small metal rings from strap tensioners and drops containing fuel residues. Separately, the composition of the soot is analyzed. The analysis shows the presence of combustion products of synthetics and wood, which means the stove was actively used that night, and not just for warmth. The chimney flap still smells of last winter, but a dull note of chemicals already points to February 2017. Outside the stove, almost sterile cleanliness. Too much for a cabin that foresters and hunters usually visit with thermoses and dirty boots. Meanwhile, the laboratory table receives the laptop, phones, and storage media confiscated from Piotr. The most useful device turns out to be the most inconspicuous. The work laptop with the stained lid. On it, an XMPP messenger. In the settings, no one had deactivated logging. The client obediently stored the conversation history in a folder. Forensics opens text files, dry data, nicknames, and messages. In them, a second voice appears, that of Tomas. First, months before, a correspondence in a closed forum of people who are pained by the topic of silent disappearance in different ways. Exchange of links, an argument about morality, long night paragraphs. Then, the switch to XMPP, more convenient and private. In fact, not more private. There was no end-to-end encryption. The keys were not changed, which means everything they wrote was preserved line by line. The sentences are emotionless, but their content cuts to the bone. Need a quiet place, one writes. "There's a forest house. I'll get the key from an acquaintance," the other replies. Then follows a list: tripods, an action camera, a generator in case of a weak network, strap tensioners, so hands don't tremble, cleaning supplies, just in case. They discuss the timing. Meet at Jabika. Further, A6, exit Australia. Night. And recording. And then the phrase that will become the scar of the case: make a recording of the last evening. In the context of the correspondence, the word last has nothing to do with romance. Tomas persistently writes that he wants no funeral and no publicity. Piotr responds with calm instructions and, oddly, adds technical details: file names, formats, even how the folder on the memory card should be named. On Piotr's laptop, small but characteristic traces also appear: screenshots of individual messages. He took screen photos for memory, the draft of a post announcing a live stream that was never published, logs of internet speed tests along the highway the day before the meeting. All this looks like meticulous preparation for an event that was not supposed to be a random joyride, but a planned scene with technology and roles. No traces of a third person in the chats. Occasionally, only an observer from the forum appears, asking if one can watch, to which Piotr replies, "It depends on the network." Physical and digital merge. In the cabin, bleach, traces of cleaning, ash with remains of rope and strap rings. On the laptop, calendar entries, a list of what to take, the route, and the agreement with Tomas about the meeting and the recording. This is not a random contact and not a spontaneous ride. It is a coordinated trip where one person is responsible for the place and the technology, the other for his presence and the strong desire to disappear without ceremony. The mystery of their acquaintance is solved. A closed forum brought them together, and ex-MPP chats sealed the plan. But how exactly did the night in Dolak proceed? And what remained on the memory card that someone tried to heal with fire? Here, paper and text logs give way to video files. Experts extract fragments from the empty MSD card, and this will be the key to understanding Tomas's last route. Next, reconstruction minute by minute. How long the camera ran when the sound cut out, what words were on the recording and which disappeared forever. But before the video fragments are meticulously assembled, a disruptive noise enters the case, money that came out of nowhere. Who was the third viewer? The crypto expertise, running in parallel with the laptop analysis, finds an incoming transfer on one of the addresses linked to Piotr's wallet. 0.05 BTC, a significant sum by then current standards. In the memo for the broadcast. The meaning is clear. Someone was expecting a live stream. Via the blockchain chain, the transfer leads to an exchange, and an exchange, a boring and pedantic institution, keeps documents. Upon request, the KYC data arrives. The payer is a man from Pula, a coastal city further south on the map. Not a relative, not a colleague of Piotr. According to the questionnaire, an ordinary office worker who likes football and craft beer. He is invited for an interview. He is nervous, but opens his phone without playing with passwords. In the correspondence, short sentences. Will there be a stream? Comma. Yes, if the network can handle it. The address for the transfer. A thumbs up emoji. After that, silence and a message from Piotr. Reception in the forest is bad. We're postponing. The payer assures that he did not drive anywhere that night. It is checked. The cameras of a pub on Pula's main street record him from 2110 until almost closing. At the counter, a bill for several IPAs and a burger, paid by card. After that, recordings at the exit, a taxi, the terminal books the ride to his house. The mobile phone logs from the telephone company confirm the device was connected to the antennas in the city area all night. no trips towards Rijeka, and certainly not into the mountains. To finally understand that the third was only an observer, Piotr's equipment is examined. On his phone, a series of speed tests along the highway and at the turnoffs to the cabin. Empty ping diagrams, failed attempts, download speed, less than 0-point-something megabits. One sees how he tried it the day before and on the day of the meeting, and then gave up. Near the cabin, the connection breaks like a wet thread. On the laptop, the draft of a post announcing a live stream, not sent. Next to it, a file with an example of a recording title that remained an example. The puzzle fits together simply. The man from Pula paid for the promise to watch, but remained sitting in front of a blank player's screen. He was not in the car, did not stand behind the camera, did not approach Dolak. This is a false trail, appealing because it involves money and is therefore dangerous, but fully closed by receipts, cameras, and the antenna on the pub's roof. Piotr, on the other hand, acted alone. He prepared the place, transported the canister, set up the tripods, and tried to figure out how to do a live stream where there is no reception. It did not work. And when this branch is cut off, the most important thing remains on the table: the recording itself. The fragments recovered from the damaged card, the metadata of the camera's clock, the snippets of sound. Everything that can tell the story of the night in Dolak better than any chats and transfers. Next, a reconstruction that can no longer be contradicted by money or someone else's alibi. When the money and the viewer from Pula are put aside, the question that started everything remains. What exactly did Pota K and Tomas B agree on? The answer does not lie in black masks or secret organizations. It lies in the text, carefully saved by Piotr in a folder with screenshots. The black background of a closed forum, nicknames instead of names, and a thread with a harmless title like Exit Scenarios. Piotr under the nickname Chronicler, the Chronicler. He writes at length, without emotion, as if drafting instructions. I can help with documenting the departure. There follows a list of services: camera setup, lighting, storage of files in a safe place, so that everything is recorded and organized. His language is dry, almost technical, and that is precisely what is more disturbing than any threat. Tomas signs up under the nickname Finis, the end. His messages are shorter. I don't want a funeral. I want to disappear cleanly. Between them, a correspondence develops in which there is no argument, no haggling, only the discussion of a ritual. In the XMPP chats, the chronology can be clearly followed. November, first contact in the forum. December, a video call for getting to know each other, where they test how the camera and sound work. January, logistics. Piotr suggests a forest house, far from the roads, promises to get the key from a forester friend, lists the inventory, tripods, generator, strap tensioners for fixation, cleaning supplies for afterward. Sentences that send a cold shiver down one's spine sound as if formulated by an archivist. Documentation, session, final file. Tomas asks direct questions. Will there be traces? Can it be done so that I'm not found? Piotr replies, everything will be recorded. Afterward, we'll clean up. In February, a precise schedule appears in the chat. Meeting at Jabika, drive via the A6, record the last evening. In the screenshots, there is even a draft for a file, covering the names of folders with data. What is important is what is missing from these conversations. There is no money as a motive there, no promises of fees, no haggling over services. Piotr demands no payment. He demands recognition. A like in the forum, the opportunity to show it to the chosen ones. For him, It is control over the scene and proof of his own importance, even if only before a dozen anonyms. For Tomas, it is the romanticized image of leaving without a funeral, so that no one stands by the coffin and speaks the usual words. They are not connected by greed, but by a shared, very dark scenario in which one takes the role of director and the other is the consenting participant. And here the customary but harsh formula must be stated. Legally, consent changes nothing. It does not absolve one of responsibility. In the records, it will remain an agreement where the keywords are recording and last evening, and next to it, prepared straps, chlorine-based chemicals, and a furnace that burned all night. We see the motive not in money or a sudden outburst of rage, but in the desire to put a check mark in one's own perverse project. Prepare everything, perform the ritual, make a recording, eliminate the traces. Thus the enigma of their acquaintance closes. Chronicler and Finis found each other in a narrow corridor of the network where people are promised a beautiful disappearance without witnesses or funerals. But words are only half the battle. The other half is what the camera could still capture before the memory card met the fire. And now that the roles and the motive are clear, the hardest part remains. Reconstructing the night in Dolak from fragments, by the increments of the file names, by the audio dropouts, by how a sheet of paper with the last lines enters the frame. Reconstructing the night from fragments. But first, these fragments will be presented to the man who conceived it all. What did Pota K answer when presented with the chat logs and the data from Dolak? An office without theatrics. The investigator reads soberly, the nicknames Chronicler and Finis, the lines about the recording of the last evening, the inventory list. Photos are placed on the table. The siphon with the chemicals and Tomas's DNA, the ashes with the synthetic fibers and the rings of the strap tensioners, the traces of cleaning on the wall. Next to them, the route map, Jabika, Rijeka Istok, Grobnik, Australia, printouts of the ENC logs with timestamps, camera images, the key with the Dolak tag, the Forester's SMS, the failed speed tests on the phone. The memory card as evidence, the same MSDRE with heat traces. Do you recognize this laptop as yours? Yes/no. Is this your vehicle? A pause. The investigator's voice does not once rise. Piotr asks for water, adjusts his sleeve and remains silent. The formula about the right to remain silent, and then silence. No version, no explanations. He refuses to testify. But by this point, the evidence is already complete. Route, chemicals, DNA, chats, the key, and the specific hut. The further path is clear. An indictment and the transition to what is stronger than all words. The reconstruction of the night based on video fragments and metadata. Reconstruction based on video fragments. The next step. But the main question is simpler. What was on the damaged memory card? In the lab, an image of the MSD card is created, and file carving begins. Video data is extracted not by file names, but by byte signatures. The header is missing, the container is damaged, the audio lags. Piece by piece, 11.5 minutes of footage are assembled. The camera knew what it was filming, but it had forgotten its name. Technical boredom becomes the jewel of the case. The image begins with a slight jerk in the first frames. A static point. The tripod stands against the wall of the hunting lodge. In the frame, a table with 2 cups, a kerosene lamp. On the left, the edge of the stove is visible. A low hum is heard. It sounds like a portable generator. In the 3rd minute, a man in a work fleece jacket enters the frame, recognizable by face and size, Pota K. He adjusts the optics, steps back, stands sideways so as not to obstruct the view. In the center, a chair. On the chair, Tomas B, his hands fixed to the armrests with strap tensioners. He looks into the camera and unfolds a sheet of paper. He reads in Polish, evenly, without pauses, about leaving of his own free will, asking no one to search for him, without a funeral, without publicity. In German, these words would sound like a testament in one sentence. Several times he falters and glances to the right. There, outside the frame, Piotr gives instructions. Louder, from the beginning. At one point, Piotr approaches, tightens the strap on the backrest, returns to the edge of the frame. No outbursts of aggression. Everything seems filmed for an instruction manual, cold and methodical. The soundtrack at the end runs slightly ahead of the image with a slight echo, but the meaning is not lost. Tomasz finishes reading the note, lowers his gaze. Then Piotr is heard uttering the phrase about the last evening and checking the camera's display. The recording abruptly cuts off, without credits or a still image. Exactly how technology stops when it is switched off in a hurry. The metadata preserved at the block level matches February 12th, 2017. This is also indirectly confirmed. The increment of the camera's file names, the time of the last synchronization with Piotr's smartphone, the mobile phone logs. Image, sound, and data fit the route. Meeting in Rijeka, driving via the A6 Dolak hut. The video does not show everything, but it shows the essentials. 2 people in a room, the preparation of a recording, and a note read aloud. From this moment, conjectures end. This is direct evidence with which the case moves from the level of versions to the level of the court, to the question of how these 11 minutes will sound in the courtroom and what they will mean for Pota K. And these 11 minutes no longer sound in the laboratory, but in the courtroom. A screen, the Dolak hut, a sheet of paper in Tomasz's hands. But how did Pota K's defense react to the video recording? The line is simple and seems to be the only possible one. Consent. The lawyer shows printouts of the chats, quotes phrases like, "I want to leave without a funeral," and "everything will be recorded," calling Piotr not an aggressor, but an executor of another's will. He tries it on the technical track. The video lacks a complete file header. The sound floats in places, so the recording is unreliable. He requests that the video be declared inadmissible and the correspondence be classified as private and not reflecting the reality of that night. The prosecution responds dryly. Firstly, a person cannot legally dispose of their right to end their life. Consent to this is void. Secondly, the source of the video has been identified. The storage medium was secured according to protocol. The chain of evidence has not been broken. The incomplete header and asynchrony are consequences of thermal damage, not of editing. Thirdly, the recording shows no plea for help, but a prepared recording. Strap tensioners, the commands louder and from the beginning, then the abrupt cutoff. This is not observation from outside. These are active actions. The court hears a psychological expert. This expert analyzes the dynamics of the relationship in the messages and on the video. In Piotr, there is a pronounced need to control and document, a pedantic construction of a ritual, the search for recognition from an audience. In Tomasz, vulnerability and a romanticized idea of disappearing without publicity. Such a connection, according to the expert, does not legally make the event voluntary. One controls the process and leads it to the outcome. The other agrees without understanding the consequences. The decision sounds sober and is without effects. The court rejects the defense's arguments regarding consent and the inadmissibility of the recording. The video is recognized as evidence, the chats as admissible material, and the psychological report is added to the files. The loophole is closed. Pota K remains in custody, and the trial enters the phase of the full main hearing. Witnesses, expert opinions, the minute-by-minute route, and that hut where everything was recorded. Ahead, are the substantive negotiations and the verdict. The loophole is closed. It remains to put everything together in a single line. What is the full, step-by-step version of events, according to the investigating authorities? February 11th, day -1. Piotr buys a knife, a roll of rope, 2 plastic tubs, and bleach. The receipt is dated for the evening. At the same place at INA, he buys fuel and fills a canister. On the same day, he drives the grey Astra onto the A6 and turns off towards Mokopalj. The ENC logs record this. Equipment appears in the Dolak hut. Tripods, an action camera, a portable generator. This will be confirmed by both the receipts and the traces inside. February 12th, 17 hours, 6 minutes. Tomasz enters Zabicha Square. Cameras capture him getting into the grey Astra. 17 hours, 18 minutes. The car is on the E65. 17 hours, 32 minutes. Grobnik, 18 hours, 1 minute. Australia, exit. Around 18 hours, 10 minutes, they are at the hut. Inside, prepared strap tensioners. On the table, a lamp and 2 cups. Late into the night, preparation of the scene. Piotr adjusts the optics, checks the sound, makes test notes on his phone. 22:30, beginning of the recording, recovered fragments from the micro SD, time confirmed by metadata and synchronization with the smartphone. Tomasz sits on a chair, his hands are fixed. He reads a note about the last evening into the camera. Between 22:30 and 0:47 on February 13th, the critical interval after which Tomasz shows no more signs of life. Traces of bleach and his DNA remain in the siphon, in the oven. Ash with melted synthetics and the rings of strap tensioners on the wall. A trace of cleaning. February 13th, early morning. 5:40. The Astra leaves Dolak. On the toll road, the car drives towards Rijeka. In the parking lot of a gas station, Piotr buys 2 coffees on offer, but he is alone in the car. This can be seen in the video. 7:12, a camera on the bridge over the Riechina captures him in the city. After that, the destruction of evidence, the ash in the oven, the burned memory card, the chemical treatment, and Tomasz's discarded backpack in a container near Fujina. 2 weeks later, this very backpack will turn up during sorting and return a name to the case. Every step here is supported by concrete evidence. The receipt, with the knife and the rope, the ENC protocols and cameras, with the route, the Dolak key and the forester's SMS, with the location, the expertise, with the chemistry and the DNA, the recovered video with the scene itself. In sum, this is not improvisation and not a ride share, but consistent preparation, execution, and an attempt to cover the tracks. Only one formality remains, more terrible than all conjectures. The investigator's version culminates in a verdict. The version of the investigating authorities culminates in a verdict. What decision did the court of the city of Rijeka make? The trial lasts from June 3rd to November 20th, 2019. The hearings are without sensationalism, protocols, motions, experts one after another. The court hears forensic technicians, digital forensic experts, a psychologist, a dog handler. It summons employees of the toll company, security personnel of the bus station, the forester, and an employee of the sorting plant. On the screen, the evidence is reviewed point by point. The recovered 11.5-minute video from the Dolak cabin, the XMPP protocols, the ENC route, Zabicha, Rijeka Istok, Grobnik, Australia, the key with the Dolak tag, and the forester's SMS, the ash from the oven with synthetic fibers and the rings of the strap tensioners, the traces of bleach and Tomasz's DNA in the siphon, the receipt from the hardware store, and the receipt from INA, the camera footage, The defense reiterates the consent line and disputes the admissibility of the video. The court rejects this. In the finale, the hall falls silent not because of rhetoric, but because of the formula everyone was waiting for. The court finds Pota K guilty of concurrent offenses: murder with particular cruelty, disturbance of the peace of the dead, obstruction of justice. The sentence: 28 years of imprisonment. In addition, post-penitentiary supervision is ordered. 5 years of supervision with restrictions on the use of anonymous internet services and mandatory therapy. The judgment formula is read evenly and without pauses. A legal point is set in the case, not an emotional one. Guilty, convicted. The story, which began with an unnamed backpack, receives an official judgment number and a date. The story received a number and a date. What happened after the trial? Piotr was sent to serve his sentence. The judgment contains a paragraph about the time after 5 years of supervision, review of devices, ban on VPN and encrypted messengers, no anonymous network, mandatory therapy. Dolak is locked with a new lock. The forest is silent. Only traces and some processed fragments were found in the oven and siphon. Nature did not return the rest. Legally, a point is set, factually, an ellipsis. We know the route and the technology, but we don't know the last minutes. The video cuts off, and after that, there is silence. Pota K is serving his sentence. Tomas B's name remains as a closed case on the wanted list, and in the memory of those who waited for him at home. The story, which began with a backpack at the waste sorting, ends with an empty chair in front of a camera. You know, there are stories that grab you not by their scale, but by some frightening proximity. When you suddenly realize that all of this happened not in a movie, but right here, behind the next wall, in the most ordinary apartment building that you might have passed hundreds of times. The story of apartment 3B in Zaragoza is one of those, and it all started, as it often does, with complete nonsense, with everyday life. On January 20th, 2020, the downstairs neighbors called the emergency services. The complaint was ridiculously simple. Water was dripping from the ceiling. A common occurrence. It happens all the time in such buildings. But to this banal leak, there was, shall we say, a bonus. A smell. And that could no longer be called banal. The neighbors couldn't quite describe it. Not gas, not wiring. Something sweetish, heavy, that made you uneasy. And it came from the same place, from apartment 3. B firefighters and police arrived at the call, and they were met with a blank door and an equally blank silence. No reaction to knocking. They tried to ring the doorbell, but it wasn't there. Just torn out, with 2 wires sticking out of the wall. And at this point, I think everyone already had a bad feeling. After all the formalities, it was decided to break in. The clanging of metal, the screech of the lock, and the door gave way. The first thing that hit them was that same smell, only now it was so dense that it seemed you could touch it. The apartment was like a crypt. The windows were tightly sealed with some film, not a ray of light. In the gloom of the living room, in an armchair, sat a woman. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared into space. You know, that's the kind of look people have when their thoughts are already very far from here. Next to her stood a teenage girl. Pale, quiet, like a shadow. But the worst awaited in the children's room. There were 3 beds in the room, and in each lay a child. 2 boys and a girl. In pajamas, covered with blankets. They looked as if they were just sleeping soundly. The room was in perfect order. No signs of struggle. No blood. But there was no air in it. It was dead. And when the policeman who had seen everything in his life looks at this scene, at this quiet, neat room, at the frozen mother, at the girl paralyzed with horror, he understands that this is not an answer. This is not even the beginning of the story. This is the end. The end of something long and monstrous that was happening behind this door, while the downstairs neighbors were complaining about a leak. And when this initial shock subsides, that very police work begins, which is rarely shown in movies. Paperwork. Because every life, even one that ended in a sealed apartment, has its paper trail. And the investigators needed to understand, who are these people? Not in the sense of what their names are, but who were they to the outside world? And that's where the mystery grew even deeper. House registers and social service archives were checked, and on paper everything looked, well, if not normal, then at least explainable. The family moved into this apartment on May 28, 2012, almost 8 years ago. Composition: mother, Elena Pardo, her partner, Oscar Munoz, and 4 children. The eldest, Lucia, the silent girl, and the 3 younger ones, Diego, Lucas, and Marta, those who were found in the beds. The neighbors rarely saw them, but that's not a crime. Seclusion is a choice. The most interesting thing was elsewhere. Since that same 2012, all 4 children were listed as being homeschooled. Elena and Oscar diligently submitted all the necessary documents and received benefits. For the state, for this entire bureaucratic machine, they were just a family with their own peculiarities. A little strange, unsociable, but a perfectly functioning unit of society. They existed within the system. And this official, almost prosperous picture did not at all match what the police saw behind the door of apartment 3B. On paper, everything was legal. And it was this legality, this contrast between a certificate from social services and 3 lifeless bodies in the children's room that made the whole story truly creepy. And this paper, legal life could have continued for who knows how long, for years. After all, for the system, for social services, everything was in order. But sometimes, in the most well-oiled mechanism, some small detail breaks, and the whole structure collapses. And in this story, such a detail was an ordinary water pipe. Just think, the alarm was raised not because someone heard screams, not because the neighbors noticed something suspicious in Elena's or Oscar's behavior. This entire airtight, sealed life was revealed by a banal leak. If not for it, if not for that water dripping from the ceiling, we might never have known what was happening behind the door of apartment 3B. It all started with the downstairs neighbor, an ordinary man who one morning simply saw a wet spot in his kitchen. The first reaction was annoyance. He went upstairs, knocked. Silence. Knocked louder. Silence again. Well, it's a common occurrence. He called the management company, left a request. But a day later, the spot grew larger, and that smell appeared. Neighbors later described it differently, but one of them found the strangest and most accurate comparison. It was like someone had a barbecue in January. This smell permeated the stairwell, mixing with the damp smell from the leak. And it was this combination, mundane and horrifying at the same time, that made the building manager, who came to the call, dial 112. So the authorities' intervention was a result of pure chance. Not citizen vigilance, not the work of social services, but a leaky pipe and the strange smell of roasted meat in the middle of winter. A chain of absurd coincidences that led the police to this door, and when the lock gave way, this chain was broken, and a completely different story began. A story about what exactly they discovered in this quiet, sealed apartment. And so, when the story of the leaky pipe ended, the work of the forensic experts began. This is no longer about emotions or shock. It's about a methodical, cold examination. Protocol, measuring tape, photographic documentation. And the longer the experts worked in apartment 3B, the more it transformed from a place of tragedy into some kind of insane puzzle. Windows sealed with film, a torn-out doorbell. All this spoke of a desire to isolate oneself from the world. But one detail did not fit into any logic at all. In a small, cramped pantry without windows among some old junk stood a charcoal grill. Just imagine this scene. An ordinary apartment in an apartment building. And a grill, not an electric grill, but a real one, for charcoal, for a picnic in nature. It just stood on the floor in the pantry. This discovery immediately took the investigation to a new level. This no longer looked like a strange, reclusive family. This looked like the set for a very bad movie. Examining the pantry further, the forensic experts noticed something else. The ventilation grate under the ceiling was completely sealed with tape, airtight. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that air did not leave or enter from there. At first, it didn't form a coherent picture, just a collection of oddities. A grill, sealed ventilation, 3 children who looked as if they had simply fallen asleep. But a few days later, the first results of the forensic medical examination arrived from the laboratory, and everything fell into place. The cause of death for all 3 was carbon monoxide poisoning, a lethal concentration of carbon monoxide in the blood. And at that moment, the grill in the pantry ceased to be just a strange object. It became evidence, a weapon. Now the mystery had a physical explanation. But this only made it more terrifying because now the main question was different. How did a barbecue grill become a working murder weapon in a locked apartment? And only 2 people could answer this question. 2 adults who lived in this apartment, who in theory should have protected these children. The mother, Elena Pardo, and her partner, Oscar Munoz. And this is where the classic detective story turns into some surreal nightmare. Because one of these 2 was at the scene, and the other had vanished. Imagine this scene from the investigator's point of view. You have a crime scene. You have the deceased. And you have 2 adults responsible for them. One of them, Elena, is sitting right in front of you. She is in profound shock. She was taken to the station, but the interrogation isn't working. She speaks, but it's not testimony, but some incoherent, fragmented stream of consciousness. She cries, then falls silent mid-sentence, then starts talking about debts, about how he didn't want them to be seen. Her words are just white noise, in which it is impossible to grasp either logic or truth. She is either broken by grief to the point of insanity, or she is playing the most convincing role of her life. And where is the second one? Where is Oscar Munoz? While some investigators tried to break through Elena's wall of silence and shock, others began to look for him. And it quickly became clear that Oscar had disappeared. He worked as a night watchman at some warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He didn't show up for his last shift. Colleagues couldn't reach him. His phone was turned off, and his last known location, which they managed to pinpoint, was somewhere in the vicinity of the house. And then, silence. He simply vanished. And at this moment, the investigation receives 2 clear, parallel vectors. On one side, Elena, a woman who was in the apartment at the time of the tragedy, but whose testimony is absolutely useless. On the other, Oscar, a man who disappeared precisely at the moment everything came to light, and who automatically becomes the main suspect. Now the police had 2 tasks. First, to get the mother to talk, to try to extract at least a grain of truth from her incoherent babbling. And the second, equally important, to find her missing partner. And while some were looking for a ghost named Oscar, Others were trying to piece together the puzzle from Elena's incoherent words. In such cases, investigators cling to any, even the most insignificant, detail. And such a detail was her mobile phone. An old, cheap device, almost empty. No social networks, minimal contacts, almost a complete lack of correspondence. The phone of a person who deliberately erased himself from the digital world. But among this vacuum, there was one clue that at first seemed strange, and then turned everything upside down. These were bank notifications. Short, system messages about money transfers through the BISM service. The amounts were small, but they arrived with frightening regularity. Every week, almost on the same day, a small sum would trickle into Elena's account. And all these transfers were from the same person. The sender's name was Raul Santamaria. This discovery shattered the entire worldview that the investigators had already built for themselves. The family of hermits, living in complete isolation, actually had constant and stable financial contact with someone from the outside. Who was this Raul? A relative no one knew about? An old friend? Why was he sending them money? And the most important question, the one that sent shivers down the investigators' spines. Did he know what was actually happening behind the door of apartment 3B? Was he just a compassionate acquaintance helping a family in trouble? Or was his role in this story far more sinister? This thread completely changed the dynamic. Now the investigation had not 2 paths, but 3. There was the missing Oscar, the main suspect. There was the broken Elena, the main witness who could say nothing. And now he appeared. Raul, the mysterious benefactor, the third party in this story, whose motives were absolutely unclear. And with his appearance, the investigation broke free from the dead end of the locked apartment and stepped into entirely new, unknown territory. And so, while some investigators tried to find this mysterious Raul, and others searched all over Zaragoza for the missing Oscar, a third group continued to work with Elena. And the more they talked to her, the more they understood that the main mystery of this story was not in what she did, but in what she didn't do. She didn't call. Studying her phone data, forensic experts stumbled upon a chilling silence. From the moment the tragedy occurred in the apartment until the firefighters forced open the door, almost 3 days passed. And during these 3 days, not a single outgoing call was made from her phone. Not to an ambulance, not to the police, not to friends, not to relatives, to no one. For 3 days, she stayed in the sealed apartment next to her deceased children and her surviving daughter. And she remained silent. What fear, what horror must paralyze a person so much that they don't even try to save their own children? Or at least call for help when everything has already happened? The answer to this question was given by that same silent girl, the elder daughter, Lucia. When psychologists finally managed to get her to talk, she uttered a phrase that became the key to all of her mother's behavior. She said, "Mum was scared. She was afraid that if she called, they would take us away." And later, in her incoherent testimony, Elena confirmed this. Her fear of the outside world, of the system, of prison, of having her last surviving child taken away proved stronger than her maternal instinct. She was not a monster in the classic sense of the word. She was a person driven to the extreme of despair and panic. Her inaction was criminal, but its motive was not malicious intent, but a paralyzing, irrational fear. And this completely changed the picture. It removed her role as an active participant and shifted the entire weight of suspicion onto the one who cultivated this fear in her, onto the one who locked them in that apartment and simply disappeared, onto Oscar. And so, when the entire weight of suspicion shifted to Oscar, the investigation turned into a real ghost hunt. But how do you catch a person who seems to have simply stepped out of this world into nowhere? The answer is simple. You have to follow his tracks. Even the most inconspicuous person leaves traces, especially in our time. Financial, digital, and it was these, not Elena's incoherent mumblings, that ultimately told the investigators what really happened in apartment 3B. And this story began with the most ordinary, boring cash register receipt. While some patrols combed the city in search of Oscar, others, the analysts, pored over his bank statements. They looked for anything: large cash withdrawals, bus or train ticket purchases, any hint of where he might have fled. Most of the time it was routine, monotonous work. Small purchases at the supermarket, bill payments. But one transaction made the analyst lean back in his chair. A small amount, spent a few days before the tragedy at the enormous Bricomart construction hypermarket on the outskirts of Zaragoza. The purchase itself at such a store did not arouse suspicion, but something about its date, its proximity to the fateful events, made the investigators examine it in more detail. 2 detectives went to that very Bricomart, a huge hangar, buzzing like a beehive, filled with the smell of fresh wood, paint, and plastic. A place where people buy things to build, to mend, to create comfort. The investigators showed the manager the warrant and Oscar's photograph. They found that very transaction in the system, and when the list of purchased goods appeared on the monitor screen, silence fell in the room. There were only a few items on the receipt: a bag of charcoal, a lighter, and a massive padlock with a long shackle. This was no longer just a troubling sign. It was an alarm bell, a barbecue grill, and a lock. 2 key elements of this chilling puzzle were not just found in the apartment. They were deliberately bought together in one transaction. The investigators requested surveillance camera footage from that day. And there he was, Oscar. In the blurry black and white video, he calmly pushes a shopping cart between the aisles, takes a bag of charcoal from the shelf, then goes to the display of locks, carefully examines several models, and chooses one. At the checkout, he behaves absolutely casually. No nervousness, no haste. He pays with a card, takes the bag, and leaves. A man who simply bought everything necessary for a picnic. This receipt and this short video became the turning point in the case. They turned the version of an accident, of tragic negligence, to dust. This was preparation. Cold, methodical, calculated. The investigation had irrefutable proof of what is called, in legal terms, premeditatio, premeditation. Now it was not just an investigation into a mysterious death. It was an investigation into a coldly planned crime. And the main question now was not what happened, but why? What made this quiet night watchman buy a barbecue grill and a lock to create a silent hell in his own apartment? And so this question, why, hung in the air of the interrogation room in the operational headquarters in the minds of every investigator who touched this case. What made this quiet night watchman buy a barbecue grill and a lock to create a silent hell in his own apartment? And while psychologists were only building theories, the first, most impartial answer to this question began to be provided not by psychology, but by cold, soulless forensics. The magic of precise numbers and irrefutable facts. The investigators took the data they already knew and overlaid it with a grid of expert conclusions. And the picture became terrifyingly clear. The first layer was the forensic pathologist's report. Time of death, from 60 to 72 hours before discovery. This meant that the tragedy occurred 2, almost 3 days before the downstairs neighbor noticed the leak. 3 days. This was not a spontaneous act, after which the killer flees in a panic. This was an event whose consequences someone continued to live with in the same apartment for almost 3 days. The second layer was the analysis of the utility room itself. Not just forensic experts, but engineers visited the site. They measured the volume of this tiny room, analyzed the air composition, and studied exactly how the ventilation was sealed. It wasn't just adhesive tape. Someone methodically, layer by layer, taped over the grate, leaving not a single gap. Experts calculated the rate at which smoldering charcoal in the grill would consume oxygen in such a confined space and emit carbon monoxide. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The utility room had been transformed into an effective, airtight gas chamber. Anyone who found themselves inside was doomed. And on top of all this, science lay the third, most chilling layer: domestic details. The police seized surveillance camera footage not only from the hardware store but also from the Mercadona supermarket, which was right by their home. Oscar, Eleanor, and the children were frequent shoppers there. Reviewing the footage from the last few days, investigators looked for him, Oscar, and they found him. But what they saw made them freeze. In footage taken after the children's presumed time of death, Oscar alone, in the middle of the night, calmly took out garbage bags. He did this several times. An ordinary, routine action. He was the only one entering and leaving the apartment. He was the only operator of this closed, deadly world that continued to function while the bodies of 3 children lay behind one of its doors. Science proved how it happened. Camera footage proved who did it. Now all that remained was to find him and force him to answer the last, most important question. Why? And now, with the investigation having a complete picture of how it happened and who was the only person who could have done it, there remained the last, most important question. Why? But while all efforts were focused on finding Oscar, one unsolved folder remained in the investigation headquarters. One thread that led from this sealed hell to the outside world. The name in this folder was Raul Santamaria, the mysterious benefactor who regularly transferred money to Eleanor. And investigators had to rule out the last, most improbable, yet still possible scenario. What if Oscar was not the only one behind all this? Finding Raul was not difficult. Unlike Oscar, he was not hiding. An ordinary middle-aged man with his job, family, life. When 2 detectives came to his house, he did not look surprised, rather tired. As if he had been waiting for this visit his entire life. He was brought to the station and the interrogation began. The investigators expected anything: denial, lies, attempts to cover himself. But what they heard once again turned their entire worldview upside down. Raul did not deny anything. Yes, he transferred money. Yes, he knew Eleanor. And then he looked at the investigators and uttered a phrase that explained everything. "Lucia is my daughter." It was a shock. The surviving girl, a quiet shadow, a witness to all this horror, was his child. Raul told his story. He and Elena had a brief affair many years ago. When she became pregnant, he got scared, was not ready for responsibility, and simply disappeared. But years later, his conscience got the better of him. He found her, already living with Oscar and other children. He wanted to somehow be involved in his daughter's life, to help. But he ran into a blank wall, not from Elena's side, but from Oscar's. He set a strict condition. If you want your child to have everything, pay. But you will not see her. And Raul agreed. He paid. He bought not silence about a crime, but the right to know that his daughter was at least not starving. He paid so that he would be left alone. He feared Oscar, his strange, oppressive aura, and preferred to keep his distance. The investigators listened to this confession, and the version of an accomplice crumbled before their eyes. But it needed to be verified. The procedure was standard. They requested his phone billing, data from his work passes, recordings from cameras near his home and office, and everything was confirmed down to the last minute. In those very 60 to 72 hours when the tragedy unfolded in apartment 3B, Raul was on a business trip in another city. He had an ironclad, 100% alibi. He was neither the instigator nor an accomplice. He was another victim of this story, a man who had been blackmailed for years by his own child. And when this last thread broke, snapped like an over-tightened string, the investigation returned to its starting point, but with new, frightening clarity. No conspiracy, no mysterious sponsors, no third parties. This entire complex, multi-layered structure collapsed, leaving behind a simple and terrible truth. There was only one person, one director of this quiet horror, and he was still at large. Now the search for Oscar Munoz became a matter of honor for the Zaragoza police. And so, as the Zaragoza police threw all their efforts into finding Oscar Munoz, the city seemed to hold its breath. His photograph, an ordinary, unremarkable face of a middle-aged man, was in all the news, on all television channels. Wanted notices were sent to all patrols. Investigators were sure it was a matter of time. A person cannot simply disappear in a modern metropolis. But days passed and Oscar vanished into thin air. And while operational groups scoured hostels, train stations, and abandoned warehouses, another team of investigators was engaged in an equally important matter. They dug. They dug into the past. They unearthed archives trying to piece together the history of this family to find the moment when everything went wrong. And in one dusty cabinet, in a folder of unreviewed citizen complaints, they found something that made even the most experienced detective's hair stand on end. They found proof that they had already been at this door and left with nothing. It was a short, dry report, dated 2018, 2 years before the tragedy. A neighbor called the police. She complained about strange, loud screams from apartment 3B. Not just a child's cry, but something hysterical, full of despair. A regular patrol was dispatched. 2 police officers went up to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. Silence. They knocked again. After a few moments, the door opened slightly on a chain. Eleanor stood on the threshold. The report noted that the woman looked tired, but behaved absolutely calmly and politely. She apologized for the disturbance, said that the children were just making noise before bedtime, playing too loudly, but now she had already put them to bed. Behind her, the apartment was quiet and dark. The police, following instructions, asked to see the children. Eleanor, without any argument, replied that they were already asleep and she did not want to wake them. She even readily showed them some papers, certificates stating that the children were homeschooled, everything official, everything certified. She spoke so convincingly, so casually, that the patrolmen did not have the slightest suspicion. They had no legal grounds to break into the house of a polite woman whose children were simply making noise. They asked her to be quieter in the future so as not to disturb the neighbors, and left. The report was filed under the designation false alarm. The door to apartment 3B closed again, and the hell that was happening behind it got another 2 years of life. When the investigator in 2020 finished reading this short document, he sat in silence for a long time. This was not just an oversight. It was a failure of the entire system. It became clear that the tragedy in this apartment was not the result of one terrible day. It was the finale of a years-long, methodical, diabolically conceived play. Oscar and Eleanor were not just hiding. They created a perfect disguise. They used laws and rules against society itself. Homeschooling, official certificates, a polite smile on the doorstep. All of this was part of their protective cocoon. They made their children invisible to the outside world long before they extinguished their lives. And the realization of this fact made Oscar's personality even more sinister. He was not just a killer. He was a puppeteer, a manipulator who had pulled strings for years, remaining in the shadows. And now this puppeteer was somewhere out there, on the city streets. And no one knew what performance he was preparing next. And so, when this puppeteer, This director of domestic hell became the most wanted man in Zaragoza. Everyone awaited the climax. They expected his capture to be loud, dramatic, with a chase and sirens. But, as often happens in such stories, the ending turned out to be ridiculously mundane. Oscar Munoz was not apprehended as a result of a special operation. He was recognized by an ordinary patrolman in a small coastal town where he had fled. He was simply sitting on a bench on the promenade, looking at the sea. When the police approached him, he did not resist. He simply stood up silently and extended his hands for handcuffs. The hunt was over, and the most important part began: the confrontation. The interrogation everyone had been waiting for, the moment when the monster would have to face his deeds. He was brought back to Zaragoza, to the very interrogation room where Eleanor had sat a few days earlier. Only now the atmosphere was different. There was no confusion. There was tension, dense like a coiled spring. Two of the best investigators sat opposite Oscar. They did not start with threats or pressure. They simply silently placed the first sheet of paper on the table. It was a photocopy of that very receipt from the Bricomart construction hypermarket. Oscar lowered his eyes, looked at the shopping list: charcoal, lighter, padlock, and not a single muscle twitched on his face. He simply nodded. Yes, he bought it. The investigator calmly asked, "Why?" And Oscar began to speak. And his voice, even monotonous, devoid of any emotion, was more terrifying than any scream. He denied nothing. Yes, he locked the children in the pantry. Yes, he put that very padlock he bought on the door. He explained it as if he were talking about a parenting process. It was a punishment. They, according to him, were too noisy, disobedient, violating his established silence schedule. The pantry was their version of the corner, a place where they were supposed to reflect on their behavior. He talked about it as if it were the most normal thing in the world, just a strict father punishing disobedient children. Silence hung in the room. The investigators exchanged glances. They expected lies, denials, but not this icy, methodical confession of what was essentially torture. And then one of them asked the next question, the main one. And the brazier? Why was a brazier needed in a locked pantry? And that's when Oscar uttered the phrase that became the quintessence of all this horror. The phrase that all newspapers would later quote. He looked at the investigator with an absolutely clear, innocent gaze and said, "So they wouldn't catch a cold." It was cold in the pantry. I didn't want them to freeze. Care. He called it care. He placed a source of deadly carbon monoxide in a hermetically sealed, taped-up room without ventilation so that 3 small children wouldn't catch a cold. At this moment, even the most experienced police officers who seemed to have seen everything in this life barely maintained their composure. They looked at this man and understood that before them was not just a criminal. Before them was absolute, distilled evil, wrapped in the shell of absurd, selfish logic. He did not consider himself a murderer. In his twisted worldview, he was a victim of circumstances, a caring father whose parenting methods just got a little out of control. The interrogation was over. Oscar Munoz admitted all his actions, but he did not admit intent. He painted a picture in which he was the main character, trying to restore order, and everyone else was disobedient actors who spoiled his play. And this version, this monstrous interpretation of events, was more terrifying than any remorse. It meant that now in court they would have to prove not what he did. He had already admitted that. They would have to prove why he did it, and break through the wall of his icy, impenetrable madness. And at this point, the case seemed to have reached a dead end. A logical, psychological dead end. On one side, a mountain of evidence: the receipt, the padlock, the brazier, the taped ventilation, expert testimonies. On the other, Oscar's icy, impenetrable madness, his absurd version of care that could not be disproved because it existed outside of all logic. It was his word against circumstantial evidence. And in this battle, he seemed invulnerable, but the investigation had one last trump card, the strongest and most terrifying. A voice that until this moment had only been heard in quiet rooms with psychologists. The voice of the only surviving witness. Lucia's voice. Working with her was long and delicate. The best child psychologists in Zaragoza spent several weeks, step by step, bringing her out of shock. They did not pressure, did not rush. They simply created a safe space for her where, for the first time in many years, she could speak without fear of punishment. And when she finally began to tell her story, it became the irrefutable evidence that shattered Oscar's icy fortress to its very foundations. In her account, there was no hysteria or childish exaggerations. She spoke calmly, almost formally, and this factual accuracy sent shivers down one's spine. She said that the room without a window, as they called the pantry, was not an isolated incident. It was a system, the main punishment in their house. For any transgression, for loud laughter, for an extra word, for attempting to look out the window, they were sent there. For 1 hour, for 2 hours, sometimes for the entire night. It was a well-oiled mechanism of control that kept them in constant fear. And then she spoke of that last evening. The reason for the punishment was ridiculously trivial. They were simply playing too loudly. Oscar, who was particularly irritable that day, burst into the room and ordered all three of them, Diego, Lucas, and Marta, to go to the room without a window. He left Lucia. She was on duty. Her task was to look after her mother, who was having another panic attack from all the stress. And Lucia saw everything. She saw Oscar bring a brazier from the kitchen. She heard him tell his victims that it would be warmer for them that way. She saw him lead them out of the pantry, light the coals right in the apartment, wait for them to heat up, and then lead them back inside. And she heard the last, most terrifying sound, the click of a padlock. Her calm, childlike voice, listing these facts, became a deafening verdict for the investigation. Lucia's testimony destroyed Oscar's version of accident and care. It was not negligence. It was a methodical, cold-blooded act, the final act in a years-long play of domestic terror. Her words became the missing element that tied all the evidence together and proved intent. Now it was not Oscar's word against a store receipt. It was his word against the direct testimony of an eyewitness. And that battle he had already lost. And so he lost this battle before it even began. Because against the calm, factual account of a child who saw everything with her own eyes, no lie, no matter how sophisticated, can stand. Lucia's testimony became the foundation upon which the prosecution could now build an ironclad, irrefutable case. But for the investigators, there remained one last, purely formal, but psychologically important step. They needed to look him in the eyes and see his reaction. To see what would happen to this icy, impenetrable monster when he heard his own world, built on fear and lies, crumble under the voice of a little girl. They arranged a confrontation, not in the sense that they brought Lucia into the same room with him. No psychologist would have allowed that. They simply read him the transcript of her interrogation. Oscar was brought back to the same room. He behaved the same way as the first time, calmly, almost detached, with a slight hint of superiority. He was still in his role, the role of a strict but fair father who was misunderstood. The investigator began to read. In a steady, monotonous voice, he read Lucia's testimony about the room without a window as a system of punishment. about that last evening, about the brazier that was brought so it wouldn't be cold, about the click of the padlock. And as Lucia's words filled the room, Oscar's mask began to crack. His composure evaporated. He stopped looking at the investigators. His gaze darted across the table, across the walls, anywhere but to meet their eyes. When the investigator finished reading and silence hung in the room, he asked only one question. "Do you want to say anything about this?" Oscar remained silent. He just sat, staring at the table. All his self-confidence, all his absurd logic had vanished. He was exposed, and his silence at that moment was louder than any confession. His lawyer, realizing the game was over, leaned over to him, whispered something, and stated that his client would no longer give testimony. At this point, the investigation was virtually complete. All evidence had been collected, all witnesses interrogated. The puzzle was complete. The case was ready to be sent to court. The story moved from the quiet offices of investigators and police stations to become public knowledge and find its denouement within the walls of the courtroom. And when his silence became the last, loudest confession, the case moved to a new stage. From the quiet offices of investigators, it moved to the echoing corridors of the court. But before we move on to the courtroom battles, to the speeches of lawyers and prosecutors, it is important to do one thing. It is important to pause for a moment and gather all the facts, evidence, and testimonies we have learned into one single, coherent picture. Let's, based on all the data, reconstruct minute by minute that very evening when life in apartment 3B stopped forever. So the evening of January 16th, 2020. To the outside world, it was an ordinary winter evening in Zaragoza, but in apartment 3B there was its own special atmosphere. An atmosphere of tense silence, which at any moment could be broken by one wrong move. And it was made. The three younger children, Diego, Lucas, and Marta, forgot themselves and started playing. Too loudly. Their laughter became the trigger that launched the mechanism of catastrophe. Oscar, who was in a particularly bad mood that day, reacted instantly. He ordered all three to go to the room without a window. Lucia, the eldest, he left as on duty to look after her mother, who was already on the verge of a panic attack. Then everything happened as if in slow motion. Oscar leads the children into the pantry, utters his monstrous phrase about warmth, brings the brazier, lights the coals, and finally hangs a padlock on the door. At this moment, according to the case materials, it was approximately 10:40 p.m. And then the worst thing happens. Oscar doesn't panic. He doesn't stay to check if everything is all right. He acts according to his usual routine. He calmly gets dressed, takes his work bag. At 10:55 p.m., the surveillance camera at the entrance records him leaving the house. He goes to the bus stop. At 11:10 p.m., his face is caught again by the camera lens, this time inside a night bus that takes him to the warehouse, to his shift. He simply locked the children in a deadly trap and calmly went to work. And this cold, minute-by-minute chronology compiled from Lucia's testimony, camera data, and billing records became the prosecution's main weapon. It left no room for doubt, for interpretations, for the version of a tragic accident. It painted a portrait of a person who committed a monstrous act with full awareness of what he was doing. And now this portrait was to be presented to the court. And this portrait, cold, methodical, horrifyingly detailed, was to be presented to the court. The trial concerning apartment 3B became one of the most high-profile in the history of Zaragoza. The hall was packed with journalists, relatives, and simply the curious. Everyone wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had turned his family into a personal concentration camp. But the main question hanging in the air was no longer a domestic one, but a legal one. The facts had been established. But how would the law qualify them? What was it? tragic, monstrous negligence, or cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The entire judicial battle came down to a duel of two interpretations. Two stories. Story 1. The prosecution's version. The prosecutor, step by step, built an iron chain of events before the jury and judge. The purchase of coal and the lock. The methodical sealing of the ventilation. And finally, the final act. Oscar locking the children in and calmly leaving for work. The prosecution insisted this was murder with indirect intent. Oscar, being an adult, sane person, could not have failed to understand that smoldering coals in a small sealed room would inevitably lead to death. Perhaps he did not directly desire it, but he consciously allowed such an outcome. His version of care was shattered to pieces by Lucia's testimony and experts' reports. This was not care. It was indifference to human life in its purest, most distilled form. Story 2. The defense's version. Oscar's lawyer tried to paint a completely different picture. The portrait of a simple, uneducated man. A strict, perhaps even cruel father, but not a murderer. The defense emphasized that this was accidental homicide. He did not want their deaths. He genuinely did not understand all the risks associated with carbon monoxide. He simply wanted to punish them, to isolate them, and he placed the brazier out of his own, albeit perverse, notions of care. They tried to prove that there was no intent to deprive them of life in his actions, but only criminal, monstrous stupidity. The court listened to both sides, examined the evidence, returned again and again to Lucia's testimony, and finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The hall fell silent in anticipation. The judge read the verdict. Oscar Munoz was found guilty of 3 counts of aggravated murder. The court did not believe the story of a stupid but caring father. His actions were deemed conscious and purposeful. The sentence, 22 years of imprisonment. Elena Pardo also appeared before the court. She was tried not for murder, but for criminal inaction, for not doing anything, as a mother, to save her children. Her fear was not considered a sufficient justification. Her sentence, 6 years and 8 months of imprisonment. Justice, expressed in the dry figures of the sentence, was served. The story, which began with a trivial leak and a strange smell, found its end in the courtroom. But for those who touched this case, it will never end. It will remain an eternal reminder of how thin the line between everyday life and madness can be, and what a quiet, unnoticed hell can hide behind the ordinary door of apartment 3B. And at this point, it would seem, one could conclude, justice, expressed in the dry figures of the sentence, was served. The story, which began with a trivial leak and a strange smell, found its end in the courtroom. But for those who touched this case, it will never end. It will remain an eternal reminder of how thin the line between everyday life and madness can be, and what a quiet, unnoticed hell can hide behind the ordinary door of apartment 3B. But when the sentences are passed and the cameras in the courtroom are turned off, one last, most important question remains. The story is over. The guilty are punished. But what next? Did this tragedy become a lesson? Or did the system, which blindly ignored this horror, understand nothing, simply turning the page? First, about the fates. Oscar Munoz and Elena Pardo, as expected, filed appeals. Their lawyers tried to soften the sentences, again telling stories of misunderstanding and fear. But the Court of Appeal, having examined all the case materials, upheld the sentences. 22 years for him, 6 years, and 8 months for her. The legal chapter of this story was finally closed, and Lucia, the surviving girl whose quiet testimony destroyed the wall of lies, was immediately placed under permanent state protection. Her further fate is another story, a story of rehabilitation, an attempt to return to a normal life, and it is, fortunately, hidden from public eyes. But the main outcome of this tragedy occurred not in the courtroom, but in the quiet offices of officials. The story of Apartment 3B stirred up all of Spain, and it initiated a large-scale internal investigation into the work of the social services in the Aragon region. The focus was on that very report from 2018, that very visit by patrol officers who left empty-handed. And the investigation revealed a critical legal loophole. Inspectors and the police did not have clear authority for forced entry into a dwelling if there was no direct, irrefutable evidence of a threat to life. A polite smile and the phrase, "The children are sleeping," were enough for the system to retreat. So now, this is not enough. The deaths of Diego, Lucas, and Marta led to the adoption of a new internal instruction, a new protocol. Now, if inspectors record repeated, systematic refusals of access to children, or if multiple complaints are received from different neighbors, they have a direct legal basis to immediately request a court order for forced entry. They no longer need to take someone's word for it. That legal gap through which Oscar Munoz dragged his domestic terror for years has been closed. And this, perhaps, is the only bright spot in this dark, suffocating story.